You're watching a special edition of Pronews 7 at 10. The Pronews 7 Talk. Here's Jay Ritchie.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another Pronews 7 Talk program where we devote the lion's share of our newscast to the discussion of a key topic in the news that affects us all tonight. That topic is same-sex marriage. The U.S. Supreme Court on June 26 struck down part of the anti-gay marriage law called the Defense of Marriage Act, and some of the effects of that ruling were felt instantly in the days that followed. What the court didn't do is decide the broader issue of same-sex marriage rights nationwide, but what it did do was rule that same-sex couples married in 13 states and Washington, D.C., where it is legal, as well as states that legalize it in the future, should be treated equally under federal law when it comes to things like retirement benefits and taxes. Instantly, in places like California, there was this, a new flood of weddings. But some of the effects of the ruling won't be felt for months. And in Texas and 34 other states where same-sex marriage is banned by constitutional amendment or state law, when, if ever, will those effects be felt? What about couples who married in gay marriage states then moved to a state that doesn't validate their unions? How will the courts and the IRS deal with cases in those states? Those are some of the issues we may be talking about this evening. For tonight's discussion, we've assembled a panel of three who can address that issue from a variety of perspectives. My guests are Michael Timcisco, a member of Amarillo's gay community who's had a gay partner for 28 years, he tells me, and who consented to be on the show to talk about the effect this ruling will have on him and on other Americans like him. Brad Howard, an Amarillo lawyer with the firm of Brown and Fortunato, who specializes in labor and employment law, and David Green, a minister from the Amarillo Unitarian Universalist Fellowship. Gentlemen, my thanks to you many times over for being part of the program tonight. Allow me to get this whole thing started with your reactions to that ruling. Michael, you first of all, 28 years with a gay partner. When this ruling came down, what were your thoughts, your feelings?
Well, Jay, my partner Jason and I were ecstatic at the ruling. And to be perfectly honest with you, we never thought that we would see this in our lifetime.
And in Texas, I guess we still have a long way to do. When do you see it happening, if at all, maybe in your lifetime in Texas?
With the rate that this issue is moving, as quickly as it's moving, yes, I do think that we'll see it eventually here in Texas, that we will be recognized in the state.
Brad, as a lawyer specializing in labor law, when this all came down, what kind of, I guess, headaches did that first initially cause?
Well, I got a lot of calls. It's really going to change the legal landscape nationwide. Initially with all the states that do recognize same-sex marriage, it's changed the legal landscape altogether. Suddenly, federal benefits are going to be afforded to all those people. But the calls I get are from clients in Texas and in Oklahoma and states that don't recognize same-sex marriage, wanting to know, what's the new world for us?
Mm-hmm. And David, as a minister, what kinds of thoughts did you have when that Supreme Court decision came down?
I was frankly overjoyed. I thought it was well past due. I believe that it's an issue of justice and civil rights, treating everyone fairly. And I think that as a person of faith, that's an important aspect of what we're about.
We've had a lot of comments on Facebook, a lot of questions today, so I'll start with something else. Terry and Anita on opposing views here. And David, we'll start with you to go back across the way. Terry said, equal rights is one thing, same-sex marriage is another. And yet Anita says, kind of like separate but equal, eh? Again, history is repeating itself with different targets. Interesting comment on that. Are these two sides of a coin, or are they the same thing?
Well, I think the most important thing for us to look at is our history, and I see this as a civil rights issue, that if you're an American citizen and you pay taxes, you should be afforded the same rights of every American citizen under law. And so it's the latest, in my opinion, civil rights issue, just like civil rights for African Americans, women's equal rights. It's this very similar, very same issue.
Brad, do you agree with Terry's statement that equal rights is one area, but same-sex marriage is another area entirely?
Well, I think there's really a lot of overlap at this point with the court's ruling. The Supreme Court relied on the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution in ruling that it would be necessary for federal benefits to extend to those that are legally married in and a state that recognizes that. So in the Windsor case, for example, where gay marriage is legal, Ms. Windsor had to pay approximately $300,000 in estate taxes because the federal government doesn't recognize gay marriage. So in this post-DOMA world, equal protection is the hallmark of this ruling. I think we're going to see that same issue all across the country in time.
Michael, your take on that equal rights platform?
Well, Jay, I come from a fairly large family and a Catholic family, and I know in one of my discussions with one of my sisters and her husbands, and or husband, not husbands, we were discussing at the time civil unions, and same-sex marriage came up as well, and my sister happened to say to me one time, well, I think that y'all deserve to have some marriage rights, but apparently not all of them. And so whenever you mention separate but equal, I think that that was a prime example of you can be afforded some rights, but not all rights.
And back to those civil rights days again.
Exactly.
True, right, Michael?
Exactly.
Let's take our break now. We have a ton of other questions. We'll go back to some of those right after these commercial messages.
You're watching a special edition of Pro News 7 at 10, the Pro News 7 Talk. Here's Jay Ritchie.
Welcome back to the second segment of tonight's Pro News 7 Talk, discussing the topic of same-sex marriage and what effect the recent Supreme Court decision will have on America. Panel, I have to bring this aspect of the issue in because most of the people on Facebook were talking about it today. Many argued the comment, one way or the other, that the Bible explicitly states that marriage is only between a man and a woman. And David, I've got to start with you as a minister to talk about that. Is that fact, fiction, open to someone's interpretation? What is that? Brad has passed on answering this, so we'll talk to David and Michael on this question. But David, you first. You have the floor.
It is completely open to interpretation, and I want to respect those who read the Bible a certain way, but there are so many things that today we do not do in a biblical sort of way. We wear blended fabric shirts. We eat cheeseburgers. Both of those things are prohibited strictly by the Bible. And so we have to look at what was appropriate, what was needed in the time that the Bible was conceived and written, and what works for us today. And the truth is, historically, homosexuality, believe it or not, was not a moral issue. It was a way of distinguishing between a type of religion that was being formed and native religions. And so that's why we have certain prohibitions against homosexuality, especially in the Old Testament. But again, it's open to interpretation. There are many Christians who do not share those kinds of beliefs that were expressed in the messages you received.
And David, or Michael, when you hear those kinds of comments from people, what type of argument do you formulate? What kinds of comments do you give them back?
Well, Jay, that's always been a struggle for me personally. I think it's a struggle for any gay person. You know, we're all God's children. If God had not intended for there to be homosexuals, there probably wouldn't be. Now, my faith has expanded over the years, and so personally, Jason and I are not looking for a blessing from a church, any sort of blessing for our marriage. We're not looking to be married in a church. We're looking for the benefits and the civil rights that come with a legal relationship like marriage.
And they are coming after the Supreme Court decided. Brad, we'll get you in on this one. Jane on Facebook writes, isn't one of the key questions here the impact this ruling will have on couples who married in gay marriage states and then moved to a state that doesn't validate their unions? What happens to them? And in the short term, how does that couple protect themselves from things like tax liability and power of attorney, those kinds of things?
That is a big question. The Supreme Court expressly passed on the question of whether states can forbid same-sex marriage. And so in the 13 states and the District of Columbia, which recognize same-sex marriage, when those couples move to other states, they can lose a lot of those protections because states like Texas and others that refuse to recognize same-sex marriage. So what a lot of lawyers advise clients to do in that situation is in your home state where you were married to protect yourself. And there are all kinds of legal documents that will ensure that your intent is carried out should you move to a state that doesn't have the same legal protections.
Are we going to see month to month for some time now new developments on this decision and how we should be handling those in all of our lives?
Well, absolutely you will. And in fact, the federal government's working overtime right now to figure out how do they take this Supreme Court decision, which says that you can't deny federal benefits, and apply this nationwide to states that don't recognize same-sex marriage. So the Obama administration has directed the Attorney General to federalize the issue, to address the issue nationwide, and so we'll see a lot of changes in the law.
Let me get one more question in before we go to our next break. Just from the news, you may have seen the story of the gay Colorado couple who are pursuing a discrimination complaint against a Colorado bakery, saying the business refused them a wedding cake to honor their Massachusetts ceremony and alleging that the owners have a history of turning away same-sex couples. We'll start with you, Michael. Do you think that constitutes discrimination or merely the business's right to refuse service?
Well, to me it is discrimination, Jay. But I also agree that a business does have a right to refuse service to someone. It's like someone going into a restaurant without a shirt. No shirt, no shoes, no service. They have that right. It's not necessarily right.
And the ACLU has picked up that case, and we'll see where that goes from here. Brad, from a legal mind there, where are you thinking about that?
Sure. Well, what I think the Colorado situation shows is someone's aggrieved by a business decision, and I might not necessarily call that discrimination. It may be that that part of Colorado has a particular local ordinance that might affect that employer, but in most places that wouldn't legally be discrimination as I understand the term, as most employers understand the term.
And David, what's your take on how that's all developing in Colorado?
Well, this isn't a particularly religious point of view, but I just think it's bad business. Because why would you want to turn away any customer? And, you know, it's hypocritical to me, because how do you know that a customer may be one way or another? And so if you look at what happened before DOMA, every Fortune 500 company was in favor of repealing it. So big corporations, if they're getting online to this, small businesses are going to be discovering that they're going to be hurting if they're discriminating against same-sex couples.
Very true. What surprised me most is it was in Colorado. Okay, it was in Colorado. I can't quite get that. More from our guests and our discussion right after this.
You're watching a special edition of Pro News 7 at 10, the Pro News 7 Talk. Here's Jay Ritchie.
And we welcome you to our third and final segment of our Pro News 7 Talk tonight, looking into the court's same-sex marriage ruling. And then, gentlemen, there is this area of thought dealing with the question brought up on Facebook today by Haley and Sheila. Haley writes, "Who cares? Let them do what they want. Stop trying to limit our freedoms and rights. Can't we focus on what's really wrong with our government instead of who marries who?" And Sheila says, this is a civil matter, capital letters, that's being turned into a matter of curtailing religious freedoms to promote discrimination. What do you think? Is this more a legal issue, David, that goes to separation of church and state really more than anything else?
Well, marriage has always been a combination of legal and religion. You know, I agree with Haley's comment, and that is that I think from a religious standpoint, God has much bigger fish to fry than worrying who loves who and who marries who. There's you know, poverty in the world. There are ecological problems going on. So much inequality. Dr. Martin Luther King once said that the long arc of history bends towards justice. And a core concept of biblical justice, if you're talking about biblical issues, is justice. And so I think we're compelled to, as people of faith, as Christians, as I am, to seek that in any way possible. And when we can do that with our religious practices, support same-sex couples and their spiritual walk, including marriage, that's a positive thing that we should continue doing.
Where does separation of church and state, Brad, enter into your legal mind, talking about those questions?
I think the larger issue from a legal framework is more of the state's rights, and that is the state's rights to define what is marriage. And what the Supreme Court recognized, and Justice Kennedy addressed this specifically, is that the states have the right to define what marriage is, and it's not going to be complete unless those married couples in those states are also accorded the federal benefits. And so what he talked about was you can't have a second-tier type marriage. You should be entitled to have all the same rights as someone who's an opposite-sex couple. So I see states' rights as being a very large issue.
And Michael, when this separation of church and state argument comes up, what is brought to your mind?
Well, I believe that there are marriages that are religious in nature, and I believe that there are marriages that are civil in nature. I think marriage is what two people make of it. If you want that religious blessing, you can get that. But you also, with that, have a civil, legal marriage. Then you have those marriages that are performed by the Justice of the Peace, or in some cases, at a drive-up in Las Vegas, Nevada. How serious do you take your marriage?
We've got about 2 minutes left, so I'll get one more answer from you on this one. Joan on Facebook says, I've seen one report. We'll start with you, Brad, because this is right in your wheelhouse. I've seen one report that says one key question is whether the IRS will treat a same-sex couple as married for tax purposes based solely on whether they live in a state that recognizes their union. I know that's going to be a while before we see something from the IRS, but is it clear yet where they're leaning or when that decision might be clear?
No, it's my understanding that's a work in progress, if you will, but what I've read most recently is that President Obama is interested in defining the benefits to married couples by the state in which they're married. So you look at the state of marriage, and that'll dictate what the law is, what the rules are. That being said, there are more than 1,000 federal laws that are contingent on how you define marriage. So it's confusing in the sense that you might be married in one state for a particular federal program and unmarried in another, if you will. So I think the government's got an awful lot of work to do.
And that's why we have lawyers. I think that's probably one of the reasons right there. I wish we had 20 more minutes, but we're out of time. Sorry. Michael, Brad, and David, thank you so much for being here and talking about this very complicated and an issue that's going to be with us for quite some time. Appreciate you all being here. Mr. Brian James has the weather for you right after these words.